In November 1979, 52 American diplomats were taken hostage by radical Islamic extremists that overthrew the country of Iran and held them hostage for 444 days. This event damaged American influence in the world and contributed to the defeat of President Jimmy Carter by Ronald Reagan. Coincidentally, the release of the hostages coincided with President Reagan's inauguration. It's ironic that just 4 years earlier, in April 1975, a similar situation was evolving in Saigon, South Vietnam. The consequences of taking the American mission in Saigon hostage were far more severe, as there were thousands of American diplomats, agency personnel, Vietnamese allies, and faithful third-party nationals who were at grave risk. America, and the world for that matter, was spared from the cataclysmic hostage situation due to the insightful and brave leadership of a small contingent of Army, Air Force, and Marine warriors whose leadership and dedication to duty saved the lives of thousands of civilians who were successfully evacuated from the tyranny of a collapsing country. In this episode of Our Duty to Remember, we have the privilege of hearing from Col Anthony Tony Wood, United States Marine Corps retired, who as a young captain, along with U.S. Army Special Forces Captain George Petrie, organized and vice-commanded the Special Planning Group of civilian volunteers that arranged for the protection and evacuation of thousands of American diplomats, civilian workers, and third-party nationals from Saigon. All of this work was done covertly, without the authorization and knowledge of the U.S. ambassador, who forbade any efforts to evacuate the American mission in South Vietnam. This is a story of American exceptionalism that is seldom shared. Let's join Colonel Wood as he recounts his experience as a leader of this effort to protect and save American lives during the fall of Saigon, to a packed audience at the Dallas Frontiers of Flight Museum.
In December of '74, the North Vietnamese attacked from their sanctuaries in the west. And they seized Phuc Long, and just a few months later, on the 10th of March, they seized Ban My Tho. Now, Ban My Tho was the intersection of a T. On either end of the T were Pleiku and Kon Tum, and the only road at which the South Vietnamese could retreat connected Ban My Tho with Saigon. Ban My Tho was seized. That cut off the entire corps, one Army Corps in the west. They quickly collapsed and then started a retreat which turned into slaughter, along with 30,000 civilians. The day after Ban My Tho fell, I received orders directing me to report to Major General Homer Smith, the defense attaché in Saigon. Now, for those that aren't familiar with it, the defense attaché is the highest ranking military officer we have in a country, normally, and is in charge of supporting, other than if we're waging war, of course, in the country, but in peacetime, he's the highest ranking military officer, and he's in charge of the logistic support and other matters that we're waging with the country. His office was in Saigon. The DAO, which is the Defense Attaché Office, and I'm going to be using that term throughout. I was to report to the DAO and then directly to Major General Homer Smith. Now, let me tell you something. I hadn't seen a Major General, much less reported to one. I'm a 29-year-old captain. I've been out in the field for 6 months, and I come in and get off a helicopter, and I have this message that says to report to Major General, to report to the Defense Attaché Office, and specifically to Major General Smith. And there, standing as I get off the helicopter, is my worst nightmare, my buddy George. George is going to go with me. I'm not sure I really am thrilled by this prospect, but he is. And so we've both been relieved of our duties and our teams. I had a Special Forces team, so did he. We went into the bunker, Major General Smith showed up, we shot to attention, and we knew he was Major General Smith because he had the stars. I'd never seen him before other than that. And I'll paraphrase, or I'll try to capture what he said. Here, take a seat, gents. He was very informal. He was a Virginia boy. I'm not any good at doing that accent, so I'm going to lay down a heavy load on you, and I'm going to speak frankly so that there is no misunderstanding. These were his words. I have a lot of it in my notes. As you have been briefed, the NBA captured Ban Mi To in the West a week ago, and the ARVN has collapsed. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam has collapsed in the West. The feeling of many South Vietnamese is that we have abandoned them. They have good reason to believe that. We've ignored the North's violations and their troop buildup, and we have forgotten our promise of air support. Nixon personally assured President Thieu that if they invaded, that we would provide both tactical and strategic air support. At the same time, we have cut their logistic support, the South, to the bone. Smith paused, he sipped his coffee, he sipped about 5 cups of coffee during this. On paper, the South Vietnamese have the advantage. But the truth is, they don't have the ammunition, the spare parts, the gasoline, or the technicians to fight the North's machine. The scarcity of fuel, the lack of spare parts, the acute shortage of ammunition threatens the South's ability to stop any North Vietnamese Army NVA push. As you might guess, all of these factors have seriously undermined ARVN morale and willingness to fight. The lack of U.S. air support after the promises was pretty much the final shot. The South's leaders are demanding that the U.S. provide that support. It isn't going to happen. President Ford has already phoned the ambassador and said that it won't happen. Now, he's telling this to 2 captains, and a lot of this is probably classified at the time. We haven't got a clue why we're being given this briefing, not by a lieutenant colonel, not by a major, not by a colonel, but by an Army Major General who's the head of everything in Vietnam. And we're really wondering exactly what we're doing there and why we're getting this personal attention, as you might guess. Continuing, General Smith started again and said, I believe that this is the beginning of the final NVA push to defeat the South and conquer all of Vietnam. Obviously, there is much more to it, but it doesn't concern us here right now. What does concern us, according to my notes, he said, is preparing for a possible evacuation of the huge U.S. mission in Saigon and our loyal South Vietnamese employees who are at grave risk in the event of an NVA victory. Continuing, there is 5 more minutes of conversation there, and he said, I'm forming a special planning group, SPG, to develop the plans for an evacuation. You will join this special group. Do you have any questions at this point? Well, more than once I've been told I should keep my mouth shut, and I didn't. I said, yes, sir. Can you tell us where we can find this special planning group? And that's when he dropped the bomb. At this point, Captain Wood, you and Captain Petrie are the special planning group. And this bunker is your new home. Any more questions? No, sir. Not a one. You will receive more detailed guidance, but I'll cover the basics with you now. Your job is to prepare a plan to evacuate the Americans and their Vietnamese employees from the inner city on short notice, very short notice. What that means is you are to focus on a plan to collect, transport out of the city, and then evacuate the members of the American mission, their dependents, their Vietnamese employees, and get them all to safety. I want you to review the existing options that generally call for evacuation from Tan Son Nhut Air Base, which is directly across the street from the Defense Attaché Office compound. Now I'm going to stop for a second because from now on it's really important to understand some of the geography. As it would be at 11 o'clock looking north, you have Tan Son Nhut Air Base on the northwest quadrant, almost to the north, of Saigon, right on the edge of the city. And right next to Tan Son Nhut Air Base, across the street, is the Defense Attaché Office compound. They're like that. That's important to remember because they both play a big role. Now, way down, almost, not quite, but almost at the south end of the metropolitan part of the city is the U.S. Embassy, in the middle of a highly populated, intensely urban zone. Nowhere near the Defense Attaché Office or the Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Both of these are the two establishments that define the rest of the story in Saigon. So if somebody says what happened to the embassy, they're talking about a building way down south with a Marine Guard detail of about 36 in the southern half of metropolitan Saigon. If they're talking about Tan Son Nhut or the Defense Attaché Office, they're talking about a huge compound or complex up in the northwest, almost at the edge of the city at that time. No longer. Today it's way inside the city boundary. But it was then. Your job is to prepare that and get the Americans, employees, their staff, their families, and the Vietnamese employees of the Americans to safety. I want you to review the existing options. There were 4 formal options that had been developed at SINCPAC and with the embassy in Saigon. And then as soon as he said that, he must have been standing outside the bunker hatch. This guy comes in and dumps a huge pile of paper on the table, which are the 4 options, and you can guess completed staff work. These are huge, huge staff studies. Basically, all 4 of them call for an evacuation. All 3 of the 4 call for an evacuation. Doesn't say how they're going to get there, but an evacuation to Tan Son Nhut Air Base, from which they will be flown out in a combination of military and civilian airliners. That's what the 3 of the 4 say. The 4th one says, and it's very skimpy, it's the helicopter operation for the evacuation of Saigon, Operation Frequent Land. I will issue further instructions after you review it, and I believe we may be forced to perform the evacuation on very short notice. Today is March the 17th. I want your assessment of all 4 options on March 20th. Now, it's just 2 feet of paper. And he wants 2.5 days. We're going to give him our assessment. Well, okay. And then, why the hurry? And this is where he defined something that turned out not to be an accurate projection. It's too bad. I think it's possible that the NVA could attack Saigon within 90 days. Well, he missed it by a couple of months. You will report only to me, interesting instructions, only to me through Brigadier General Bond, the Air Force deputy, a great guy and a real warrior. No one else. Note that, no one else. Now, he had 50 colonels and lieutenant colonels, as allowed by the Paris Peace Treaty, on his staff. That was the limit, 50 in the treaty. He had 50 of them. They weren't in the bunker. There were some questions forming in George's head and in mine at this point. The soft-spoken Virginian paused. He looked back at each of us and eyed us individually, and then he continued. I have one final comment before you get started. Ambassador Martin, that's Graham Martin, plays a big role in the rest of this tale. Called me to the embassy this morning. There, in front of the whole senior staff, he forbade any overt or visible preparation or public discussion of plans to evacuate the mission. The mission is all the Americans and their employees, all the agencies in any country. That constitutes our mission. You will have to use great discretion, understatement. You will have to use great discretion as you carry out my orders, and you will regard everything we have discussed here as classified, not to be shared with anyone without my consent. With that, Smith stood, turned on his heel, and departed the bunker. So our task was to begin planning for a short notice evacuation of the American mission and its Vietnamese employees from the city. A huge number of people, consisting mostly of agencies, the alphabetical agencies, USAID, USIS, CIA, DIA. There were 9 of them. And there were dozens of non-governmental organizations as well in Saigon. Further, because Ambassador Graham had strictly forbidden any overt sign that we were considering evacuation, we would have to plan and prepare in secret and would operate in a guarded bunker beneath the DAO compound, across the street from huge Tonsanut Air Base, northwest Saigon. Shortly after Smith departed, there was a knock on the door, and a 3rd Marine joined the special planning group. Hey, a 33% increase in personnel. Major Jim Saboteur, another great guy. We knew we had to move swiftly to build a plan, but we had no idea of just how swiftly that would turn out to be. There were some fairly important questions that needed answers. Who had to be evacuated? Where were they? I mean, we had no idea. And neither did anybody in the embassy, by the way. And for all of you who are young enough to get involved, that situation prevails today in about 80% of our embassies. They do not know where the American mission is located. If you're a Marine, you should worry about that. And critically, what conditions would we face in Saigon in the final days as evacuation became? What would a city that's falling be like? So we had to find out how many, we had to find out where they were, we had to find out what conditions would be, and we had to do all of this in secret. The first task was gathering intelligence, who, where, how, all the things that most of you have seen or been involved in before. And 4 days later, on the 20th of March, we had assembled a starting projection that we had probably nearly 22,000 people that we would be responsible for. And then the first of about 6 or 8 shoes dropped. A brunner came down to the bunker and gave us a note from Brigadier General Bond, include all of the third country nationals in your responsibilities. So by treaty, the United States has signed with 17 other countries around the world today. We have accepted responsibility for their nationals in the event of an emergency. That's what happened. So now we had to find the TCNs, and they turned out to be a serious problem. With a great deal of money whose source I have no idea from, or where it came from, I bribed the maitre d's and managers of a number of sport clubs, particularly the Cercle Sportif, which was by far the biggest and most prestigious sports club, country club, dining club, and so forth in Saigon. And about 90% of the third country nationals had membership there, or their principal did, the man, the husband. That turned out to be a gold mine for the third country nationals. Then luck stepped in, pure luck. A lot of things are important in combat and in operations, but never underestimate luck. I was going across Saigon in one of the black and white Fords that DAO had. They probably had 100 of them. And I think they were all the same year, black bottoms, white tops. And they were free taxis if you were an official member of the American mission. And the cab driver, it was a Vietnamese cab driver, he filled out a chit, and he carefully put the chit in a box between the seats. And I just caught that with the corner of my eye. Something said, watch this. I wasn't keenly aware at all, but something said, watch it. So I asked him, I said, what do you do with those chits when you finish? He said, oh, we filed all of them. I said, where is that? He showed me his box, carefully filed for the last day or two. And then I said, and where are all the chits? They're in a warehouse. Could you please take me there? We went off to the warehouse, and there stacked, maybe 100 feet of boxes. They had 2 or 3 years of cab driver chits identifying how many, where they were taken, and who. Well, in Utapao, Thailand, we had the computer complex that we had used for the POW operations in North Vietnam. And so where do you think all those chits went? And 3 days later, I'm sure somebody died making up punch cards, because in those days, that's all we had. But in 3 days, I had a printout and began the pin map. Now, the pin map was a huge map of metropolitan Saigon that we had on the wall. And as we developed different nationalities and different concentrations, we put pins in. Within 4 days, it defined evacuation planning. General Bond and General Smith were down every morning to check the pin map and to see where we were going, because, of course, we weren't going anywhere. We were actually gaining numbers. People were flying in to see their families, not shrinking the mission in March. We were going the wrong way. Then the rental records. We got a hold of the rental records. We didn't have any privacy problems in those days. And then finally, the commissary and PX passes, which were a huge help, because in those days, they were a registration point. So the huge pin map we put together on the bunker's wall to plat the evacuees came to define the process. The North Vietnamese Army attacked and seized the province of Quang Tri in the north just a little bit later. Now, this is a huge change. Up until this point, the North Vietnamese have assaulted only in the highlands and in the west. Now, they're coming straight down from the north. So we now have a twin pincer headed for Saigon. So I said, why would you expect that we're going to get any more warning? And Jim Saboteur, really savvy guy, he said, well, what are you recommending? And this is when Project Alamo was born. I said, I think we have to build an internment facility. I think we have to build something that will hold thousands of Americans and key Vietnamese safely if the North Vietnamese come to town before we're ready. And then we let Washington negotiate their safety. But we've got to do something that gives a little life insurance to this program we've got to get together almost overnight. And so Project Alamo was born. That's what we called it. And in the end, it was never used as life insurance for the evacuation. But as General Carey will probably tell you, it gave us the spot where we could safely land our helicopters and pick up the evacuees. And it was crucial to the final evacuation. But something else happened. To build an internment camp that would be secure from riots and so forth in the streets, we needed, 5 or 6 dozen people? And remember, we can't even talk to anybody without General Smith's permission. So George had led our review, George Petrie had led the review of the existing evacuation plans. And then we knew something. This was, this was kind of like the Polish mines we were learning one thing after another as this went on, because there wasn't time for anything. I mean, there just wasn't any time. And we didn't have a staff, so we didn't have to worry about anybody's feelings. So we had to know what Saigon was going to be like. Now, how do you think we did that? Anybody have any ideas? Well, George went to Da Nang and I went to Hue, and we fell with both cities. And we had to know who would mutiny. We had to know how the ethnic groups would riot. We had to know what the streets were going to be like. We learned an enormous amount. We had these little crummy battery tape recorders in our utility jacket pockets. And we just talked into them for the 2 days we were in the cities. George came back in a shrimp boat. He smelled really bad. But, we special forces, they like to eat snakes and all those kinds of things. So we had gathered an enormous amount of invaluable knowledge that shaped almost every part of our decisions from there on, from those 2 cities. The pattern of collapse was the North Vietnamese would begin threatening the outskirts of the city, the civilians would begin panicking, and then all order would break down, and I mean all order would break down. South Vietnamese and ARVN units would collapse, leaderless soldiers would become part of the crowds in the city. This happened in both cities. The looting and rioting would begin, and as we're watching this looting and rioting, as we're watching these barricades go up, and the barricades aren't being put up by the police or ARVN, they're being put up by people who want to stop the traffic and charge you a fine to get through. The fine was everything you had in the car, that kind of thing. So the snipers began, and it became a very real threat, and as you'll see, we took that into consideration too. So we now had a pretty good idea of the nightmare that was going to be Saigon. Saigon had 400,000 refugees in it on the 25th of April, 5 days before the evacuation. Refugees on top of the population. Think about that for a minute. Homeless, penniless, and scared. Okay. At least that's the figure that the book has. I cut it in half, who knows, maybe 200,000. So, I went to see Sally Vincent. Sally Vincent was the facilities officer at the Defense Attaché Office compound. And our meeting didn't go well. I needed Sally Vincent to build an internment camp. How the hell was I going to build an internment camp unless I had somebody who knew the water, the plumbing, the buildings, the kitchens, the food, all the stuff you had building, and the buildings? Well, she knew it all. And I had never been in the DAO before, a week and a half before that. We'd been out in the field in Vietnam, not in Saigon. So it was all new to me. And I started off very badly. I told her I really couldn't tell her much because she was A, a civilian, and B, didn't have a security clearance, both of which kind of, ruled her out. She got up, she walked out of her office. This is a very capable lady. She's almost 6 feet tall, and she knows what she's doing. And she wasn't going to put up with me. And I wasn't trying to be cute. I was just trying to follow orders and at the same time rope her in. Didn't work. She said, I'm going to come back, and when I come back, if you get your brains unscrambled, you can tell me what you want. Otherwise, get out. So, I did. I told her what our mission was. I told her I was a member of the special planning group. She thought that was cool until she found out what it was. And then I told her what my job was, all of which were specific violations of orders from a major general. Every one of them was. And then she said, you seem to be a pretty confident guy, and I think you've probably been successful. I replied very truthfully. I said, I suppose I had been occasionally successful in the past, but I had never before violated the specific instructions of a major general not to share this information with anyone. I had never violated regulations and shared secret information with a civilian that didn't have a security clearance. And I had never built an internment camp for thousands of people. And oh yeah, this was my first evacuation. Other than that, I thought I'd been fairly successful. So we then went to see Major General Smith. And I reported to him. He climbed up and down me, both sides for about 20 minutes. And then he said, I agree with your decision. I don't agree with the way you handled it, but you're right. We need to build an internment facility in case they get here on their schedule and not our schedule. Smart guy. He had the courage and the quiet confidence to do these things. So he said, Captain Wood, do you have any question about how your conduct will go from here on out? I said, no, sir. Wisely, I didn't say anything else this time. And by going north to Hue and to Da Nang, what the city would be like. There were a lot of lessons. So we had decided on a coordinated air and surface evacuation of the city. We would identify those buildings which would be helicopter landing site capable on their roofs, and we would identify the convoy routes and try to run the two together. Try to line the routes with helicopter-sided buildings so that those who couldn't get to the buses, which is our surface evacuation piece, could get up to a helicopter-suitable building and could be picked up at first light by Marine helicopters. So that was our plan. Marine helicopters picking up people on the roofs, and bus convoys, armored bus convoys, going on 8 routes named after the great trails of the West through Saigon, bringing all the people back to the Alamo. The Alamo now becomes a collection point as well as the life insurance. But it has a third role, too. We identify 6 helicopter landing sites within the Alamo suitable for the CH-53D. General Kerry's forces have these couple of squadrons of big CH-53Ds out at sea. And we're figuring that we might have to use them. We don't yet have the plan. We're going to go out and coordinate with the map. But we have identified 6 possible landing sites inside the secure facility that we're building for those helicopters. But we needed rooftop landing zone controls. We needed people to prepare the helicopter landing sites. We needed bus drivers, and they couldn't be Vietnamese. We knew from Da Nang and Hue that they would flee. We needed convoy guides who knew the city. We needed plumbers and carpenters because we were going to put hidden barricades in the stairwells of the buildings that had the helicopter landing sites on the roof. We had learned in Hue and Da Nang that the rioters would flush up to get to the helicopter landing sites. So we were going to make it possible to block those stairwells. And the whole staff of Pacific Architects and Engineers, to a man, 20-some guys, volunteered to do all of that and to act as convoy guides during the evacuation. So the volunteers are now growing. They're approaching 100. They're going to grow some more. Then radio operators. And oh, by the way, radios that will work in buses and will go back to the DAO. Well, you know, when you get volunteers and make them part of your vision, it helps. And the 2 guys who had a taxi company, I don't know, somewhere in their youth, said, you know what you need? You need these Motorola's. You may remember years ago we had these tan Motorola's everywhere in cities in the United States. Well, they work beautifully in the urban area, and almost nothing else does. So we drained the water tower in secret and turned it into a huge antenna, and then Marine Lieutenant Colonel Duffy Verdun was secretly flown in on an Air America chopper because we couldn't bring him in on Marine choppers. The ambassador wouldn't allow it. In fact, we weren't supposed to be going out to coordinate. So he came in. He was a communications specialist. He made a huge difference. He was a hero. And it began to fall into place. So all we needed to do now was to armor the buses. Didn't even have a concept for that, but we'd get one. We needed to fix the helicopter landing sites. We needed to get the radios working. And it went on and on and on. But there was one issue. Our plan called for Marines, helicopters, to take them off the roof. This is still early, middle of March. And it called for Marine reaction forces if the buses got in trouble. Well, then the ambassador did what you might guess he would do. No Marines would be in the city during the evacuation. They won't be outside the Alamo. And I guess that's when I flew out, sir, to talk with your 3 about that, because I had to figure out how we were going to provide security for convoys operating on 8 routes in a collapsing city with snipers and fires and so forth. Well, in the end, I decided on a bluff. And I was beginning to think that it was going to work when April the 4th occurred. Maybe the very worst day to date of my life. The The government had gotten involved, the U.S. government had gotten involved in Operation New Life. And so 300 infant orphans were to be boarded on a giant C-5 Galaxy transport at Tan Son Nhut. And they needed caregivers to fly back with them. 26 of our volunteers, all women, put their names forward to take care of the babies. And of course, when you get these volunteer groups, the people that sign up for the toughest, for jobs like that, which is thankless, are usually the people you don't want to lose. Well, that was certainly the case in this one. At any rate, at 22,000 feet, the latches failed on the ramp, and the cargo doors flew open and flew off and went through the tail, cutting all aircraft controls. Now, I don't know how this kid did it. Now I think he's a kid. Then he was probably older than I was. This captain flying the C-5 managed somehow to turn it around and get it started back to Tan Son Nhut, flying only with engines. But he was doing pretty well till he got to about 4,000 feet, according to the Air Force. Because you know, you can imagine we're all watching this. And he was doing pretty well till he got to 4,000 feet. And at that point, his descent the velocity went off the page. The aircraft crashed, broke in two, sailed across the Saigon River, landed on the other side. Part of it burned, and all of our volunteers were killed. And the number of babies killed is different in every reference that I can see, but it was at least half of them and maybe more. So when you have tragedy strike, a group that is only held together by its common morale, you've got to move fast, because you can really lose it. You can lose it in a Marine unit, but in volunteers who are being told day after day that what they're doing is important, and yet we can't get the support that we need from the embassy, it's really important. So I held this meeting. George was at the embassy with Major General Smith and General Bond. I held this meeting, and I told him, I said, look, we need to get it out. We need to mourn it. These were very special people. And then we need to find out and to go ask ourselves how many of us feel we can stay. I'm not going to ask you tonight. I'll talk with you tomorrow. Nobody will be humbled. Nobody will be criticized if they leave. 27 people have been brutally killed out of the blue by a group that's already getting tired, because they were all just about 55 to 60 years old, and they're working all night and working all day. So we waited the next morning. One person decided not to return. On the 8th of April, Brigadier General Bond, who is now in charge of all evacuation planning, sent a message to the Joint Chiefs requesting, via the embassy, requesting a company of Marines be allowed to come in and surround the Alamo and give it security. The streets are getting very bad. We're in April now. We just finished having them start the Catch a Baby Day. That's when they started. They're so panicked that they threw their babies over the wire into Project Alamo. And the Marines dropped their M16s. We had 12 Marines, and raced and captured the babies. We called it Grab a Baby Day. It was amazing. But those kids got the babies. I never saw one of them, the babies get hurt. But the populace is pretty panicked when they give up their children. And it was going bad really quick. So General Bond released his message because he had sent a copy of it to the embassy, which is protocol, and the assistant ambassador had read it. General Bond was arrested and deported to Guam the next morning. And we lost the guy in charge of evacuation plan. The ambassador had him arrested and taken out, put on a C-141 to Guam the next day. The deputy did not tell the ambassador that he had chopped the message. So, how was I planning to secure these convoys going into the city? You remember those black and white Fords that I talked about, the taxis? Well, those black and white Fords became green and white Fords with blue revolving lights on the roof and National Police insignia on the doors, 25 of them, in a secret warehouse inside the Alamo. And even on the front seat were two National Police helmets with green and white with the stripes on the back and two National Police jackets for each Ford. Now, since Marines were being forbidden to provide a reaction force in the city, and since we didn't have volunteers that could provide the reaction force, I decided we'd execute at night, because we'd learned that at night you have a real chance of carrying out an evacuation. Daylight is a bad idea. And so the plan was to go at night, and each stick of 3 or 4 buses would have 1 or 2 National Police cars escorting it. They had blinds in the windows so you couldn't tell that it was an American at the wheel. Yeah, it was a terrible gamble. But you know, it was by far the best plan of any of the available options. There wasn't any other. So we began putting it all together. And on the 28th of April, we had 144 122 millimeter rockets land in the DAO on Project Alamo. All the trailers were burned up where we lived. The Marines were killed at our gate. Both of them died from 122 rounds. And Tonsanut was burning, one end of the airstrip to the other, were Arvin planes burning. And so General Smith advised the ambassador that he thought only option 4, the helicopter lift, was possible. Grant Martin wouldn't believe it. He got in his car, he picked up General Smith, he drove all the way out to the airport, to Tonsanut, and had to see for himself. He wouldn't accept Major General Smith's word that the airport was closed. And of course it was. And that's when he turned it over to Major General Smith, who coordinated with General Carey, and the largest helicopter lift in history was being prepared at sea. 535 sorties were flown from the time the first aircraft landed in the Alamo till the last aircraft at midnight finished. And then another 3 or 4 sorties were flown the next morning at the embassy. This all occurred on the 29th. So I guess the next morning was a CH-46 to the embassy. So we didn't roll at night, which is what we needed to do, because General Smith couldn't get permission. We rolled at 8 o'clock in the morning on the 29th. We'd been ready all day on the 28th. All the volunteers were in position. Now, put yourself in the position of a lady who is a helicopter controller on one of these rooftops. 8 of the 13 were done by civilian volunteers. Now, if the street below is lost, if the convoys don't get back, and if the airplane goes wrong, you're finished. You're baked. It's over. It gets worse. Put yourself in the front seat of a fake police car in a city under martial law where the National Police can shoot on sight. What do you think would happen if they found you? Imitating them. So these volunteers had huge risk. How did we armor the buses? Volunteers came up with an idea. Below the windows, all the way around in the buses, we bradded double flak jackets. probably enough to armor the buses against small arms. And in the windows behind the glass, we put mesh, tightly spaced chicken wire. And of course we had the Motorola radio in the front connected to the water tower antenna. It all sounds a little Rube Goldberg, but it worked. And so the convoys rolled. Now, we were down to 6 routes before it started. What happened was George and I would play chicken. Each one, we would take turns different nights and play chicken with the roadblocks, because we had to know where the roadblocks were, so if we got an order to execute, we could close the routes or change them. And they were changing every night. The National Police, of course, were not stupid. So we had identified the roadblocks, but we were down to 6 routes on the morning of the 29th, and it ended up being 4 by 10 o'clock. We had so many buses being held up on Texas, going south toward the embassy, that we were able to get another couple of buses through to the embassy, and then they took 3 of the buses at the embassy, commandeered them for the ambassador's staff and his dog or something. It was never clear to me, but we never got the buses back, so that closed down another route. So things were getting hot and heavy. We lost, of the 40-some buses, 21 of them were shot up or burning by the end of the day. And at 1700, we had the last convoy. I was on the lead bus, and we had to evacuate the last 2 buses because they were burning from the Arbon Airborne, who had mutinied, at Ton Sanut, right outside the gate to the Alamo. Okay, bad place to have a mutiny. And our Vietnamese Air Force guards had signed off. They'd stayed as long as they could. Frankly, they did a good job. So I coordinated with General Kerry's folks, and Phantoms were released, and they shut down the Arbon Airborne. Didn't have to take them out forcibly. Just enough of the Phantoms was enough to do it, and we got the last convoy in. So, in the 7 days preceding the 29th, the average load in the Alamo was 7,000 people getting on helicopters and going over to Ton Sanut to get on airplanes. So it was never used as what we had intended it for, but it did provide a spot for the Evacuation Processing Center and the Evacuation Control Center. And fortunately, on the day of the evacuation, it had 6 helicopter landing sites for General Kerry's CH-53Ds. And they would come in on one route and egress on another route out to sea. Keyhole was one route, and I've forgotten what the other one was. And it was constant. It was the damnedest thing you've ever seen, these helicopters coming in and out and loading up. When George and I left at just before midnight on the next to the last chopper, we had 81 people aboard, and we thought it had to be the all-time record for a CH-53D. Now, some of the people were very small, and the Air Force naturally can. The Air Force announced the next day that they had 82 in one of theirs. So, got aced out on that one. So, what did the volunteers do? Well, here's what they did. As they came in off their buses, they parked them, in some cases rammed them into the wall because there were no brakes. I mean, we had a lot of problems with the buses. They got off them, got in line, got in a helicopter, and left. Didn't ask for anything. There weren't any volunteers left when George and I got into the Alamo late that evening. They had done their job, and they went home. Now, you, us, we represent them. Americans are tough. And when the chips are down, there's no better. None. They didn't ask for anything. They didn't even get a phone call of thanks. And you know what else? I never got a single message from them. I got a lot of messages from the Vietnamese and people we'd evacuated, but not from the volunteers. They went home, no parades, no medals, no decorations. So, in closing, I'm going to read the statement on the side of the Confederate War Memorial at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Did you know there is a Confederate War Memorial at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier? Well, there is. Yeah, here it is. Not for fame or reward, not for place or for rank, but in simple obedience to duty as they understood it. I think that pretty well covers it. Thank you for listening.
Hello, I'm Colin Kimball with the North Texas Fallen Warrior Portrait Project. Thank you for watching this edition of our Duty to Remember, as we tell the stories of our local and national heroes. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please subscribe and share with your friends as we continue to produce new content. Thank you for watching.